Unapaki huko. Wengi apate niko na simu naanza kuja nayo. Yote hapo ni kuja hapa. Wao wanakuja hapa.
Excellencies, and like we say it in Kenya, karibu sana. Karibu Kenya, hakuna matata. Heads of state from
a time
literally
of change,
round the
a time
globe
of
joining
decision making, a time of Africa moving forward. I'll kindly request we clear the front completely. We have 3 anthems.
I'll kindly request we clear the front completely. We have 3 anthems to play and would like the front of the podium completely clear. So our members of the press, we appreciate what you do, but kindly will request that we clear off completely so that we start with our 3 anthems. We'll start with the French national anthem, followed by the Kenyan national anthem, then the AU, the African Union anthem. So please, members of the press, as we appreciate that we need to mortalize this day, please will request that you clear the front so that we are able to have some semblance of order as we begin this opening ceremony of the Africa Forward Summit on this wonderful
Leaders
day.
have come together to move Africa forward. We'll start with 3 anthems, starting with the French national anthem, followed by the Kenyan anthem, and then we'll conclude with the African Union anthem. Members of the press, I'm kindly requesting that we clear the front so that we will be able to do this with some order. Kindly, if we can clear, we appreciate that you have a job to do, but also we would like to just have some semblance of order as we begin this session. So please, let's clear. Kindly, let's clear. Kindly. We request that we all clear from the front. We still have a few of you at the front. Please, let us clear so that we are able to take the anthems and give them the due respect that they deserve. Starting with the French national anthem, followed by the Kenyan anthem, and also the AU anthem finally. So we'll start with the French national anthem, Kenyan anthem, then the AU, the anthems. May I request that we may now take our seats. Your Excellency, Dr. William Samoei Ruto, President and Commander-in-Chief of the Kenya Defense Forces, Your Excellency Emmanuel Macron, President of the French Republic, His Majesty King Letsi III, Kingdom of Lesotho, Your Excellency Paul Kagame, President of Rwanda, Your Excellency Alassane Ouattara, President of Cote d'Ivoire, Your Excellency Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, President of Egypt, Your Excellency Faustin Anchange Todara, President of Central African Republic, Your Excellency Azali Assoumani, President of Comoros, Your Excellency Abiy Ahmed Ali, President of Ethiopia, Your Excellency Felix Tshisekedi, President of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Your Excellency Mohamed Ould Zohani, President Mauritania, Your Excellency Mohamed Al-Menfi, President Libya, Your Excellency Hakainde Hichilema, President of Zambia, Your Excellency General Mamadi Odumai, President Guinea, Your Excellency Bola Ahmed Tinubu, President of Nigeria, Your Excellency Joseph Nyuma Boakai, President Liberia, Your Excellency Bassirou Diomaye Faye, President Senegal, Your Excellency Mahamat Idris Deby Itno, President of Chad, Your Excellency Duma Gideon Boko, President of Botswana, Your Excellency Darman Gakol, President Mauritius, Your Excellency Dramani Mahama, President Ghana, Your Excellency Chapo, President Mozambique, Your Excellency Colonel Michael Randarinariana, President Madagascar, Your Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General, United Nations, Your Excellency Aziz Akunoj, Prime Minister Morocco, Your Excellency Russell Mino Dlami, Prime Minister Eswatini, Your Excellency Americo Jolivier dos Ramos, Prime Minister Sao Tome, Your Excellency Serazafan Zefri, Prime Minister Tunisia, Your Excellency Mwigulu Lameck Nchemba, Prime Minister Tanzania, all Vice Presidents present, Your Excellency Ambassadors, Heads of Delegation, Country Representative, Development Partners, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Your Excellencies, at this point where we see Africa moving forward, it is a day that will be marked in history as a change has begun. Allow me, Your Excellencies, at this point to invite Vivian Onano, who is going to be our moderator for this session. Vivian Onano is one who needs no introduction. She's an award-winning journalist and also has many other things that she has achieved in her accolades. Let's put our hands together as we welcome Vivian Onano, our moderator this morning. A good clap for her, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mike Gitonga, for the kind introduction. Excellencies, heads of states and governments, distinguished ministers, captains of industry, members of the diplomatic corps, fellow young leaders, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Bonjour, bon dia, salam alaikum. Welcome to the Africa Forward Summit 2026 under the theme Africa-France Partnerships for Innovation and Growth. It is my distinct honor and privilege to serve as the moderator for this presidential opening session. Please allow me to begin by expressing sincere appreciation to our co-host, Son Excellence, Monsieur Emmanuel Macron, President de la République Française, Son Excellence, Dr. William Samoei Ruto, President de la République du Kenya. Please join me in giving their excellencies a warm round of applause for their leadership and commitment to strengthening a renewed Africa-France partnership grounded in mutual respect, mutual cooperation, and shared prosperity. A big round of applause to their excellencies. Excellencies, We gather here today at a defining moment in global history. The world is resetting, and increasingly, Africa is becoming central to what comes next. Today, Africa is the youngest continent on Earth, with a median age of just 19 years. By 2050, 1 in 4 people in the world will be African. This is not simply a demographic reality. It is one of the greatest economic opportunities of our time, if properly invested in. Otherwise, it also risks becoming a major liability. Because when we speak about Africa Forward, we are fundamentally speaking about our young people. Young Africans are already driving transformation across this continent, and this was clearly demonstrated yesterday at the Youth Future Makers Forum, where both President Macron and President Ruto actively engaged with young leaders and entrepreneurs. And with greater investment in education, innovation, entrepreneurship, Africa has the potential to become one of the defining economic growth stories of the 21st century. Excellencies, how do we go from the amazing potential that we have to where we need to be at unprecedented scale and speed? Excellencies, as a young Kenyan, as someone privileged to have studied at Sciences Po Paris, and as someone who has had the opportunity to travel across more than 40 countries in Africa and continues to actively engage with young people and leaders from both Africa and Europe, I genuinely believe that this moment matters deeply for Africa, for France, and for the future of international cooperation itself. Because this summit represents possibility. The possibility of moving beyond old assumptions and building partnerships based on co-creation, co-investments, innovation, trust, and shared growth. This is strategic partnership. Africa today is experiencing one of the fastest rates of urbanization in human history, yet without a commensurate pace of industrialization. Historically, countries such as France achieved sustained prosperity through the combination of demographic growth, urbanization, and industrial transformation. Africa has the demographic dynamism, urban momentum, and now we need to accelerate the rate of industrialization at the required scale to meet the continent's extraordinary potential today and for the future. Ultimately, the Africa Forward Summit will not be measured simply by speeches and declarations, but by delivery, by investments unlocked at scale, by industries built at scale, by opportunities created at scale, because Africa Forward is not simply a slogan. It must become a commitment to build an Africa that works for its young people, an Africa that competes globally, an Africa that industrializes sustainably, and an Africa that helps shape the future of our world. This is the Africa we want. Excellencies, as I welcome our distinguished leaders to come and deliver their official statements, it would be great to reflect on a number of defining questions. What model of growth will define Africa's future prosperity? How can Africa industrialize at scale in ways that are more sustainable, more inclusive, and more competitive? How do you ensure that the partnership between Africa and France is truly equitable, future-oriented, and capable of delivering shared prosperity in an increasingly complex and competitive world? Excellency, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is now my distinct honor to welcome to the stage our first speaker, who is our gracious host and co-convener. He is a champion for African economic transformation, an increasingly influential voice in shaping Africa's place in the world, and is very committed to positioning Africa not at the margins of the global economy, but at the very center of its future. Please welcome to the stage His Excellency Dr. William Samoei Ruto, President of the Republic of Kenya. Karibu, Mr. President.
Your Excellency Emmanuel Macron, President of the French Republic and co-chair of the Africa Forward Summit 2026. Excellencies, heads of state and government, honorable ministers, captains of industry, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It is a profound honor and privilege to welcome you to the Africa Forward Summit 2026 here in Nairobi, Kenya, the cradle of humankind, the birthplace of our shared human history, and the origin of wonder. Wherever you come from, you are not merely visiting. You are returning to the very beginnings of humanity. And so, with warmth, friendship, and pride, I say to you all, welcome home. Bienvenue chez vous, karibuni nyumbani. We gather, ladies and gentlemen, at a profound, consequential moment in global affairs. The foundations of international order are being reshaped by deepening geopolitical divisions, persistent conflicts, economic volatility, climate pressures, and widening inequalities. Long-standing assumptions about global stability, cooperation, and prosperity are being tested as never before. At the same time, shifting centers of influence, changing trade alignments, and the reconfiguration of global supply chains are redefining the architecture of the world economy itself. Yet, in moments such as this, fragmentation cannot be the answer, nor isolation the strategy. The times before us demand stronger cooperation, renewed multilateralism, and partnerships grounded not on hierarchy, but in sovereign equality, mutual respect, and shared responsibility. It is not how we do it. It is in that spirit that we convene this summit, grounded in our shared conviction that enduring partnerships must not be built quality, not but on mutually beneficial investments, and not on extraction or exploitation, but on win-win engagements. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Africa and France have a unique opportunity to forge a forward-looking partnership that delivers shared progress while advancing Africa's long-term economic transformation. Africa approaches this summit not from the margins of global affairs, but as a strategic actor in its own right, endowed with vast natural resources, expanding markets, and one of the greatest reservoirs of youthful talent and innovation anywhere in the world today. We all know by the year 2050, 1 in every 4 people on Earth will be African. That reality alone will shape the future of labor, will shape the future of markets, urbanization, energy demand, and global economic growth. Over the course of this summit, our deliberations will focus on priorities fundamental to Africa's development trajectory and long-term prosperity. Among them, domestic mobilization of resources for Africa's development at scale, reforms of the international financial architecture, development of transport, logistics, and connectivity infrastructure, energy transition, and green industrialization, and of course, youth skills development to foster creativity, innovation, entrepreneurship, and AI-driven transformation. First, we must confront with honesty and urgency the question of how Africa finances its own transformation. The era in which Africa's development was principally framed through aid, dependency, and unsustainable borrowing must give way to a new paradigm grounded in investment, innovation, domestic resource mobilization, and strategic partnerships built on sovereign equality and mutual benefit. Because Africa is not part of the global problem. Africa is, in fact, the solution to the global challenges that exist today, including those of Africa. Our continent possesses vast natural resources, critical minerals, fertile land, immense renewable energy potential, expanding consumer markets. Today, friends, unlocking shared prosperity. That is the essence of the Africa Forward Summit. It is about recalibrating Africa's place in the global order. It is about redefining engagements with Africa, including with long-standing partners such as France, away from outdated models of aid and asymmetrical dependency towards a framework anchored on investment, enterprise, innovation, industrialization, and mutually beneficial cooperation. And we are very clear about this. The current international financial system remains structurally unequal. African countries continue to face disproportionately high borrowing costs, constrained access to concessional financing, and distorted risk perceptions that are frequently disconnected from economic realities that exist in this continent. The bias embedded within global credit rating systems continue to penalize African economies, increase the cost of capital, and discourage long-term investment into productive sectors. This imbalance is neither sustainable nor just. It is one of the principal constraints on Africa's ability to finance infrastructure, industrialization, climate adaptation, and economic transformation at the scale that is required. That is why Africa has supported the establishment of the African Credit Rating Agency, an important step towards ensuring fairer, evidence-based, and context-sensitive assessment of African economies and investment opportunities. Its purpose is not to replace existing global institutions, but to correct long-standing distortions of the Africa cannot finance. It is about recalibrating Africa's place in the global order. It is about redefining engagements with Africa, including with long-standing partners such as France, away from outdated models of aid and asymmetrical dependency towards a framework anchored on investment, enterprise, innovation, industrialization, and mutually beneficial cooperation. and we are very clear about this. The current international financial system remains structurally unequal. African countries continue to face disproportionately high borrowing costs, constrained access to concessional financing, and distorted risk perceptions that are frequently disconnected from economic realities that exist in this continent. The bias embedded within global credit rating systems continue to penalize African economies, increase the cost of capital, and discourage long-term investment into productive sectors. This imbalance is neither sustainable nor just. It is one of the principal constraints on Africa's ability to finance infrastructure, industrialization, climate adaptation, and economic transformation at the scale that is required. That is why Africa has supported Africa's development projects remain starved of financing. The issue, therefore, is not liquidity. It is risk architecture. That is why Africa is laying the foundation of a stronger, more resilient, and more self-sustaining financial architecture. Kenya, therefore, reaffirms its very strong support for the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions as a strategic platform for coordinating capital mobilization, risk sharing, and project execution across our continent. You remember, colleagues, that we did endorse at the last AU summit the Alliance of African Multilateral Institutions, starting with the World Bank and all the other institutions. Through institutions such as the Africa Development Bank, Africa Export-Import Bank or Afrexim Bank, Africa Finance Corporation, the Trade and Development Bank, Shelter Afrique Development Bank, Africa 50, and Africa Trade and Investment Development Insurance, Africa is steadily strengthening its capacity to finance infrastructure, industrialization, trade, housing, climate resilience, and economic transformation. These institutions are more than financial intermediaries. They are instruments of African agency, strategic sovereignty, and collective self-determination. Friends, we must believe in ourselves. That is why we strongly support the recapitalization of African Trade and Investment Development Insurance as a critical pillar of the new Africa financial architecture for development. And I must thank the President of the Africa Development Bank, who is right here with us, for spearheading this effort together with all the other multilateral institutions. This is because Africa does not need more fragmented institutions. Africa needs coordinated financial firepower capable of financing infrastructure, industrialization, trade corridors, and energy transformation in our continent on our terms. It is in this spirit that the proposed new Africa Financial Architecture and Development Framework, NAFAD, as we are calling it, seeks to align African multilateral institutions, sovereign investment platforms, pension systems, development banks, and private capital behind a coordinated continental investment strategy. Its objective is simple but transformative: to retain more African savings within Africa and channel them into productive, bankable, and transformative sectors of our economy. NAFAD is designed to unlock long-term domestic institutional capital by creating credible project pipelines, harmonizing investment frameworks, strengthening regional capital markets, and establishing mechanisms that de-risk strategic public investments. By lowering risk and risk perception and improving project preparation, African pensions and insurance funds will be better positioned to invest confidently in infrastructure, industrialization, energy, housing, and regional connectivity projects across our continent. And by the way, I am still talking about resources that are African, our own resources. Ultimately, NAFAD represents Africa's collective effort to build financial sovereignty by aligning African institutions, African savings, and African capital markets behind Africa's development priorities. And Kenya has already begun implementing the elements of this vision through the establishment of the National Infrastructure Fund, a platform designed to mobilize long-term domestic capital into strategic national projects. Already, our new National Infrastructure Fund has mobilized approximately $1 billion in the last 4 months, demonstrating the enormous potential that exists within African economies themselves. And this is money we have just mobilized here in Kenya. As government, we are deliberately partnering with the private sector to build confidence, reduce risk, and crowd in investment into transformative public infrastructure. Our objective is simple: to create credible mechanisms through which private capital can participate securely and profitably in Africa's growth story. Kenya's experience demonstrates what domestic resource mobilization can achieve. Over the last 3.5 years, we have mobilized nearly $4 billion locally for our affordable housing program. Through innovative domestic financing mechanisms, we are investing in housing, creating jobs, supporting enterprise, and expanding home ownership, while restoring dignity to millions of Kenyan citizens. This experience demonstrates a fundamental truth: Africa can generate substantial development resources internally when institutions are strong, policies are credible and predictable, markets are trusted, and citizens themselves become active participants in nation building. Excellencies, infrastructure development remains one of the most decisive foundations of Africa's economic transformation and continental integration. Africa's infrastructure financing gap continues to constrain productivity, continues to increase the cost of trade, weaken industrial competitiveness, and fragment markets across our continent. According to the Africa Development Bank, Africa requires between $130 and $170 billion annually for infrastructure investment, with financing gaps estimated at between $70 and $100 billion every year. Bridging this gap will not happen through public borrowing alone. It requires innovative financial instruments, blended finance mechanisms, de-risking facilities like the one I have talked about, and strong public-private partnership capable of unlocking institutional capital at scale. But the broader challenge before us is continental. We must accelerate investment in transport corridors, in ports, rail systems, roads, aviation connectivity, and integrated logistics ecosystems capable of binding Africa together into one competitive economic space under the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Because Africa cannot trade effectively with itself while its economies remain disconnected from one another. Connectivity is not merely about infrastructure. It is about competitiveness. It is about regional value chains. It is about food security, and it's about industrialization. And ultimately, it is about shared prosperity. Equally critical is the question of energy. That is why we must fundamentally restructure and strengthen Africa's financial architecture to mobilize the scale of capital required to finance this transformation on African terms. Excellencies, Africa possesses some of the greatest renewable energy potential anywhere in the world, from geothermal resources in the Rift Valley and on to immense opportunities in solar, wind, hydroelectric power, and green hydrogen across our continent. Africa, therefore, has a historic opportunity not merely to participate in the global energy transition, but to help lead it. But for Africa, the energy transition must also be a development and an industrialization transition. We must accept a future, and we cannot, let me repeat that, we cannot accept a future in which Africa simply exports raw green minerals, while industrial value addition, advanced manufacturing, and technological innovation take place elsewhere. That model belongs to the past. Africa must become a competitively industrial hub powered by clean energy, modern infrastructure, innovation, and strategic investment partnerships. Green industrialization presents our continent with an opportunity not only to contribute meaningfully to global climate solutions, but also to create jobs, expand manufacturing capacity, strengthen exports, deepen regional value chains, and accelerate structural economic transformation. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps Africa's greatest strategic asset is its people. This demographic and the demographic reality that it presents will profoundly shape the future of labor markets, the future of technology, urbanization, consumption, innovation, and of course, economic growth. Our youth population is not a burden to be managed. It is an extraordinary strategic advantage to be invested in. But demographic potential does not automatically become demographic power. It must be deliberately cultivated by education, skills development, research, digital inclusion, entrepreneurship, and technological innovation. We must equip Africa's young people not merely to seek jobs, but to create enterprise, build technologies, drive industrial transformation, and lead the next frontier of artificial intelligence and digital innovation. And across our continent, this transformation is already underway. From Nairobi to Lagos, from Kigali to Cape Town, young Africans are redefining finance through fintech, transforming agriculture through technology, expanding digital commerce, building globally competitive startups, and creating solutions capable of shaping industries far beyond our borders. What they require is access. Access to quality education, access to digital infrastructure, access to affordable capital, access to markets, and of course, they will create none of this realized without peace, stability, and effective multilateral cooperation. Peace, security, and development remain inseparable foundations of sustainable progress. Yet across parts of Africa and beyond, protracted conflicts, violent extremism, unconstitutional changes of government, terrorism, organized crime, and climate-related insecurity continue to undermine stability, weaken institutions, and constrain economic advancement. Current estimates indicate that Africa accounts for nearly 40% of active armed conflict globally and close to half of all internal displacements worldwide. These figures underscore both the scale but also the urgency of the challenges confronting our continent. We must therefore reaffirm our collective support for African-led peace and security mechanisms, including the Africa Union Peace and Security Architecture, predictable financing, institutional capacity, and international cooperation in support of lasting peace. But lasting peace cannot be secured through military response alone. Peace requires confronting the structural drivers of instability, poverty, exclusion, unemployment, inequality, weak institutions, climate vulnerability, and the absence of economic opportunity, particularly for young people. That is why strengthening Africa's strategic autonomy in matters of peace and security remains an imperative. And it is why we reiterate with clarity and conviction the urgent necessity of reforming global peace and security governance, particularly the United Nations Security Council. It is both indispensable and unconscionable that a continent of nearly 1.5 billion people, represented by 54 sovereign states and constituting one of the largest blocs within the United Nations, continues to remain excluded from permanent representation on the Security Council. Such inequality, ladies and gentlemen, such inequality erodes legitimacy, undermines credibility, and diminishes confidence in multilateral systems itself. No global governance architecture can credibly claim to be democratic, to be representative, to be just, or fit for purpose, while a substantial part of humanity remains absent from the table where the world's most consequential decisions are made. The time has come, therefore, for the international community to recognize, without ambiguity or without delay, that Africa cannot and will not and must not remain subject to decisions taken without its equal voice on the table. The reform of the Security Council is not merely an institutional adjustment. It is a moral obligation. It is a strategic necessity. It is indispensable to restoring trust, legitimacy, and confidence in the international order itself. Kenya, therefore, remains steadfast in its support for the common African position as articulated in the Ezulwini Consensus and the Sita Declaration, which calls for Africa to be accorded permanent representation on the Security Council with all the prerogatives and privileges of permanent membership, alongside additional non-permanent seats. Excellency, we don't need exclusion, but inclusion. We do not seek confrontation, but partnership anchored on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and of course, shared progress. This summit, therefore, presents us with an opportunity to define a new era of engagement between Africa and its partners, an era based not on dependency, but on dignity, not on extraction, but on value creation, and not on short-term transactions, but on long-term shared prosperity. Because the Africa we envision is an Africa of confidence, an Africa of ideas, an Africa of innovation, an Africa of enterprise, an Africa that believes in itself, invests in its people, mobilizes its own resources, and engages the world as an equal partner in shaping balanced, prosperous, and peaceful global future. Africa is rising, determined to shape its own destiny, and increasingly prepared to shape the future of the world itself. That is the Africa Forward agenda, an agenda grounded not on dependency, but in sovereignty, not in vulnerability, but in resilience, and not in limitation, but in possibility. That is the Africa whose time has come. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Kenya is deeply honored to co-host this summit here in Nairobi. We look forward to productive deliberations, practical outcomes, and enduring partnerships capable of advancing prosperity, stability, dignity, and shared progress for our people and for future generations. I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for the warm welcome and for reinforcing Africa's economic position today and the importance of partnerships such as the Africa-France partnership. Asante sana, Your Excellency. And now it's my profound honor to welcome to the stage our next speaker, who is also our co-convener. He's a global leader who has consistently championed international cooperation and a world of rules-based order, has been at the forefront of advancing dialogue on global economic reform and strategic partnerships between Africa and France. Please welcome to the stage His Excellency, Mr. Emmanuel Macron, President of the Republic of France. Bienvenue, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you so much. Mr. President, dear William, Your Majesty, Head of States and Governments, Secretary General of Permanent Commission of the African Union, Secretary General of Francophonie, Ministers, Ambassadors, entrepreneurs, ladies and gentlemen, Asante sana, Mr. President. And I will switch in French, if you allow me. Le président a tout dit. Et donc, je vais juste rajouter quelques convictions pour qu'ensuite on puisse passer à nos travaux. C'est un nouveau type de sommet, c'est une nouvelle philosophie, et donc nous allons aller au bout de cette philosophie. D'abord, ce sommet a commencé par des rencontres de la jeunesse, des entreprises, de la culture, du sport. Et d'ailleurs, nous allons, juste après cette session, rencontrer des représentants du monde de l'entreprise qui vont nous dire leurs conclusions et on va échanger avec eux. Et au fond, la conviction que je voudrais partager avec vous, c'est que l'agenda que le continent africain et la France doivent avoir, celui auquel en tout cas je crois, n'est en aucun cas de regarder en arrière, ni à gauche ou à droite, comme dirait mon ami le président Ruto, mais de regarder en effet devant. Et ce que je me suis efforcé de faire depuis 10 ans, c'est de bâtir une relation qui regarde avec lucidité le passé. Et donc on a eu ce travail qui a été fait avec l'Algérie, le Cameroun, le Rwanda et plusieurs autres, qui regarde avec courage le présent et qui a restitué les œuvres d'art, qui veut réinventer la relation monétaire et économique, qui veut investir dans le sport, dans les industries culturelles et créatives, dans le co-investissement avec le continent, et qui, avec respect, veut être aux côtés de l'Afrique pour son propre agenda. Et donc la relation entre l'Afrique et la France, telle que nous la voyons, telle que nous la pensons, telle que nous l'agissons, elle est fondée en effet sur la lucidité, le courage, le respect et une volonté d'avoir, au fond, un agenda partagé. Ça, c'est ce qu'on a fait depuis 10 ans. On y est longuement revenu hier et je ne veux pas être plus long. Pourquoi je suis convaincu que c'est encore plus vrai aujourd'hui qu'il y a 10 ans? Parce que les défis de l'Afrique et de l'Europe sont les mêmes. Nous voulons la paix, la prospérité, la souveraineté. L'Europe s'est battue pour cela. Elle a construit, après la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, l'Union européenne pour avoir d'abord la paix, puis un marché commun pour avoir la prospérité. Et aujourd'hui, l'agenda européen est un agenda d'autonomie stratégique pour ne pas dépendre de la domination ni chinoise ni américaine et essayer d'être sur une voie médiane qui respecte le droit international, qui croit dans l'ordre multilatéral que nous avons bâti, qui croit dans le commerce ouvert, qui ne croit pas dans l'hégémonie de quelques-uns sur les autres, qui croit que la science est la meilleure façon de régler les questions de climat comme de santé, et qui croit à l'état de droit. C'est ça ce que fait l'Europe aujourd'hui. C'est exactement le même défi qu'à l'Afrique. L'Afrique veut la paix, la prospérité, l'indépendance. Et au fond, le partenariat que nous voulons pour ce sommet Africa Forward, le partenariat auquel je crois entre l'Afrique et l'Europe, c'est un partenariat au service de la paix, de la prospérité et de cette indépendance, de cette autonomie stratégique. Il est très puissant et c'est, si nous arrivons à le faire, ce qui nous permettra, au fond, de rebâtir ensemble un ordre multilatéral qui est tellement bousculé, qui nous fragilise, dont les dérives nous touchent d'ailleurs les uns et les autres, et au fond d'être une source d'avenir pour chacun. Alors d'abord la paix, le président l'a dit, je ne vais pas répéter ce qu'il vient de vous dire. La paix passera, je le crois très profondément, par l'unité du continent africain. Et je suis très heureux de voir mes frères ici, chefs d'État et de gouvernement, ministres, présents et ayant pris la peine de venir à Nairobi. Je sais vos agendas chargés, je veux vous dire ma gratitude. Mais au fond, c'est une magnifique image, parce que c'est l'image du continent africain uni. Du Maghreb à l'océan Indien, en passant par le sud du continent jusqu'à l'Afrique de l'Ouest et cette Afrique australe. Il n'y a pas plusieurs Afriques, et souvent on a voulu nous séparer sur cela. Il y a un seul continent qui doit être respecté comme tel et porter cet agenda. Ce qui suppose pour nous d'être aux côtés de vous pour être mieux représentés dans les instances financières, mais également onusiennes. Je souscris à tout ce que le président Ruto a dit. La France défend cet agenda d'une Afrique présente au Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies. Comme nous nous sommes battus pour que l'Union africaine ait son siège permanent au G20 il y a quelques années, et nous l'avons obtenu. Nous étions quelques-uns au début et on a réussi à faire cela. De la même manière, nous soutenons un agenda, le secrétaire général l'a ô combien soutenu il y a quelques années, d'une Union africaine qui ait plus de capacité et de mobilisation pour défendre ses opérations de paix et de sécurité, qui, en articulation étroite avec les Nations Unies, peut construire ses propres médiations, à qui on donne les moyens de construire ces solutions de paix et de sécurité. Mais l'unité du continent africain, une meilleure représentation, une capacité africaine à bâtir des solutions de paix et de sécurité, et une Europe à vos côtés pour aider à financer ces solutions de paix et de sécurité, dans un partenariat de sécurité repensé, comme celui que la France a fait ces dernières années avec de nombreux États, c'est-à-dire respectueux de la souveraineté de chaque pays africain, en partenariat étroit, mais jamais en substitution, est la clé d'une paix pour le continent. De la même manière, je me félicite que nos discussions de tout à l'heure nous permettront de porter un agenda commun pour lever les blocages aujourd'hui que nous avons au Conseil de sécurité et pour continuer d'avancer pour, en cas de crime de masse, pouvoir avoir des Nations Unies qui avancent et qui décident. La paix, donc. La prospérité, ensuite. Je souscris à tout ce qu'a dit le président Ruto, donc je ne vais pas le répéter. Il a parfaitement raison sur l'agenda de prospérité du continent. Il est clair, il est simple. Et au fond, ce qu'on veut faire, ce n'est pas apporter de l'aide, ce logiciel est passé. Et d'ailleurs, vous le voyez bien, beaucoup d'États du Nord, les uns par idéologie, les autres par difficulté budgétaire, ne vous apportent plus l'aide qui était prévue. C'est une réalité, il ne faut pas se cacher derrière. Donc, on doit penser différemment la relation Nord-Sud, avec lucidité. D'abord, il faut regarder avec lucidité que la principale source de transfert qui va vers les pays d'Afrique, elle vient des diasporas. Elle vient de toutes celles et ceux qui ont émigré, qui travaillent dur dans beaucoup de nos pays et renvoient vers leur famille l'argent. Et elle reste supérieure à l'aide qui vient des gouvernements. Mais la logique dans laquelle nous devons rentrer, c'est celle du co-investissement. Et co-investissement pour faire quoi? Investir dans le capital humain, les talents et cette jeunesse. Bâtir une économie formelle. La grande difficulté de l'Afrique, c'est d'avoir une trop grande partie de son économie qui reste dans l'informel et ne permet pas à des classes moyennes d'émerger et d'avancer. Pour cela, monter dans la chaîne de valeur et être à vos côtés pour structurer une agriculture plus forte et structurer aussi une chaîne industrielle qui fait que l'Afrique ne sera pas simplement un continent de l'extraction des matières premières, des minerais critiques, des terres rares, mais de leur transformation et valorisation. Et réussir à vous accompagner dans la transformation et l'investissement en matière d'infrastructures et d'énergie. Talent, économie formelle, montée dans la chaîne de valeur, infrastructures et énergie, tels sont les éléments clés, avec aussi la logique continentale qu'a rappelé le président Ruto à l'instant. Et c'est d'ailleurs tout ce que les tables rondes qui ont été aujourd'hui portées, sur lesquelles nous discuterons, permettront de structurer autour de la santé, de l'agriculture, de l'économie bleue ou de l'intelligence artificielle. Cet agenda d'Africa Forward, cet agenda de croissance, de prospérité, c'est celui aux côtés duquel nous voulons être, par une logique d'investissement. Et c'est là où nous nous retrouvons dans cet agenda de prospérité et de souveraineté. Faire réussir l'Afrique sur le plan économique, lui permettre d'avoir plus de souveraineté, d'autonomie, c'est s'assurer pour les Européens également d'avoir plus d'autonomie stratégique par ce partenariat et de réduire nos dépendances, je dirais, aux deux grandes économies qui veulent en quelque sorte tout capter. Et donc cet agenda est commun. Ça n'est pas la France et l'Europe aujourd'hui qui vient mobiliser la totalité des terres rares, des minerais critiques ou des matériaux pour complètement capturer le marché mondial. Ça n'est ni la France ni l'Europe qui viennent vous donner des impériums en termes de solutions de sécurité. Ne vous trompez plus, ce temps est largement passé. L'agenda européen a pour intérêt de vous voir réussir sur le plan de la prospérité et de la souveraineté, parce que c'est le même que le nôtre. Si vous réussissez sur la souveraineté en matière d'intelligence artificielle, d'agriculture ou d'industrie, vous nous aidez à réussir parce que vous nous offrez aussi d'autres solutions, parce que vous offrez un avenir à vos populations, parce que vous réduisez la migration subie, qui est aussi un problème pour vos pays, parce qu'il fait fuir les talents, en même temps qu'il apporte une solution à l'agenda de l'Europe. Et donc, je veux ici qu'il y ait un réveil collectif. Quand on parle de tout ça, ce n'est pas un agenda univoque d'une Europe qui regarderait l'Afrique comme un continent qu'elle devrait aider. C'est celui d'un partenariat d'égal à égal, parce que vous aider à réussir, c'est la condition pour notre réussite. Et nous voulons le faire ensemble, de manière respectueuse, lucide et courageuse. C'est pourquoi, pour le réussir, on a voulu mobiliser le secteur privé. Et hier, on a annoncé, ce qui est une première, grâce à ce forum d'affaires, 23 milliards d'euros d'investissement privé, d'investissement d'entreprises, de fonds d'investissement, du secteur totalement privé en Afrique. Ces 23 milliards d'investissements, ce sont 14 milliards d'investissements des entreprises françaises dans les pays africains et 9 milliards d'investissements des entreprises et business leaders africains sur le continent. Cette réalisation en elle-même, c'est un vrai choc qui illustre la force de ce que je suis en train de vous dire et le fait que c'est aussi un sommet d'action. Tout ça doit passer par des choses simples qu'a dit le président, un nouveau paradigme de croissance. Des pays qui développent une stratégie de valorisation de leurs ressources, d'agriculture et d'industrie plus forte, mais aussi une politique fiscale et budgétaire qui soit plus cohérente avec cet agenda. Ensuite, c'est de réussir à mieux mobiliser nos financements internationaux. Le FMI, la Banque mondiale, comme on l'a fait ces dernières années avec les droits de tirage spéciaux, ma chère Kristalina, ensemble, la remobilisation de ces plus de 100 milliards de droits de tirage spéciaux vers l'Afrique pour mieux mobiliser cet argent et un meilleur effet de levier. Et enfin, comme l'a dit le président, c'est de bâtir au niveau de l'Afrique une vraie stratégie de garantie sur les premières pertes et de s'appuyer sur l'instrument aujourd'hui dit ATD, basé à Nairobi, qui va permettre justement, et c'est ce que nous allons nous engager à faire à vos côtés, la France rentrera au capital d'ATD et nous mobiliserons à vos côtés les solutions pour que ATD puisse jouer son rôle plein et entier à l'échelle du continent pour porter les premières pertes. Cette stratégie, c'est celle d'un nouveau paradigme financier, celle qui permet de se battre pour la prospérité du continent et pour son autonomie stratégique. Pour le reste, le président Ruto, et je vais donc couper mon discours, l'a très bien dit, et au fond c'est l'illustration, je dirais, physique et en acte du partenariat. Je ne vais pas répéter ce qu'il a dit, il l'a mieux dit que je ne l'aurais fait, je m'inscris dans ses paroles et je les endosse. Aujourd'hui, nous allons, dans un instant, nous réunir avec les entrepreneuses et entrepreneurs. Ensuite, pour ces questions de croissance, nous verrons sur l'architecture financière, nous discuterons ensuite des solutions de paix et nous allons endosser une série de textes qui vont illustrer cet agenda que je viens de décrire. Et puis derrière, donc, nous aurons les résultats de ce sommet Africa Forward, avec déjà ces résultats, ces investissements, nos engagements communs. Ensuite, avec le président Ruto, nous irons porter en votre nom au G7 d'Évian l'agenda que nous aurons défini. Et puis, tout au long de l'année, nous allons, auprès des Nations Unies, du FMI, de la Banque mondiale, porter cet agenda commun sur la base du mandat que vous nous aurez donné. Et c'est pourquoi ce sommet est, à mes yeux, un sommet aussi par lequel nous devons définir ensemble une ligne d'action qui doit nous permettre de relever les défis contemporains. Voilà, mes chers collègues, mes chers amis, je ne serai pas plus long. Je veux en tout cas vous dire la gratitude que j'ai à l'égard du président Ruto pour avoir accepté d'accueillir ce sommet de nouvelle génération, Africa Forward, la gratitude que j'ai à l'égard de vous, mes chers frères et chères sœurs et mes chers amis, d'être là, d'apporter votre contribution et votre énergie, et vous dire que la France, et avec elle l'Europe, se tiendront aux côtés du continent africain pour bâtir avec lui cet agenda de paix, de prospérité et d'indépendance auquel il aspire. De le faire avec beaucoup de respect et d'humilité, de le faire au service de ce continent qui est le plus jeune du monde et qui, l'année dernière encore, a eu la croissance la plus forte au monde et qui n'est pas simplement un continent d'avenir, mais déjà un continent du présent. Soyez fiers de ce que vous êtes. Moi, je suis très fier d'être à vos côtés et d'essayer humblement de construire avec vous cet agenda sur lequel nous investirons ensemble et nous réussirons ensemble. Vive l'Afrique et vive l'amitié entre l'Afrique et la France. Merci beaucoup.
A warm, big round of applause for His Excellency. Thank you, Mr. President, for reinforcing the shared opportunities between Africa and France to continue working together. And now I'd like to please welcome on stage one of the world's foremost champions of multilateralism, peace and security, sustainable development, and global solidarity. Please welcome to the stage His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations. Welcome, Your Excellency.
President William Ruto, President Emmanuel Macron, congratulations. Congratulations for convening this Africa Forward Summit, and congratulations for forging this renewed partnership between France and Africa for African development. Your Majesty, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the name of this summit captures the moment and the mission. Africa Forward. Forward through one of the most turbulent global moments in living memory. Africa is not waiting. Africa is moving, and Africa is leading. African continents are driving one of the defining debates of our time on how to reform a global financial architecture designed in 1945 for a world that no longer exists. Africa played a leading role in the approval of the Pact of the Future by the General Assembly of the United Nations. It is African leadership building new tools like the Borrowers Platform, and so that the countries can speak as one and negotiate from strengths. Challenging the credit rating systems that locks too many of the borrowing tools they need. Africa has had a leadership in securing the Seville commitment to expand the lending power of multilateral development banks, to mobilize private capital at scale, and to deliver relief from the debt burden crushing developing economies. It is African leadership through the African Development Bank that is advancing a bold vision to reform the continental's financial architecture from within, mobilizing African resources for African priorities and prosperity. Africa is driving a UN framework convention on international tax cooperation so that countries are no longer cheated out of what is what is rightfully theirs. And I want to praise the African leaders that have understood that it is absolutely essential also to do everything with the adequate policies and strategies to mobilize a much stronger share of national resources in order to be able to accelerate the development of the continent. And it is African leadership, alongside the small island states and other developing countries on the front lines, that has placed the climate emergency where it belongs, at the center of the global agenda. This is not a continent waiting for solutions, this is a continent producing them. But let us be honest about what stands in Africa's way. A global system designed without Africa and still largely operating without Africa, perpetuating century-old injustices. A continent of more than 1.5 billion people with no permanent seats on the UN Security Council, as was referred by President William Ruto. Without the voice, the representation and decision-making power it deserves inside the international financial institutions that shape this economy, it's not Africa that loses, it's the world that loses the fact that the voice of Africa is not conveniently taken into account. Meanwhile, as we all know, official development assistance is collapsing. Aid budgets cut, partnerships unwound, commitments walked back just as the need is greatest. So this is not only a financial crisis, this is a crisis of solidarity. Take climate change. Africa did not cause it, yet the continent is warming faster than the global average, bearing the harshest consequences in displaced communities, lost harvests, and economic shocks. Today's global energy turmoil, volatile fossil fuel markets, fragmented trade is deepening fiscal stress, inflation, and stunted development across the continent. Africa must be at the center of climate justice. The continent holds 60% of the world's best solar potential and receives 2% of global clean energy investments. With the right finance, Africa could generate 10 times more electricity than it needs by 2040 entirely from renewables. Yet, 600 million Africans still live without electricity. And 1 billion still rely on unclean cooking, a crisis that takes 800,000 lives a year, mostly women and children, mostly out of sight. And on average, the continent faces borrowing costs twice as high as OECD countries as an average, draining resources that should be building the future. That is not a market verdict on Africa. It is a verdict on the injustices of the system. The continent also holds extraordinary reserves of the critical minerals the green transition depends on. For too long, the pattern has been the same. Africa's resources have been extracted, the value captured elsewhere, the environmental damage left behind. The United Nations panel on critical energy transitions minerals points the way. Fair value chains, in-country processing and manufacturing, transparency, environmental and human rights standards, and meaningful benefits for affected communities. No more exploitation, no more plundering. The people of Africa must benefit first and most from the resources of Africa. And going back to climate change, adaptation must no longer be an afterthought. The adaptation finance gap must be closed. Africa is paying an enormous price in relation to the devastation caused by climate change, and Africa has been denied the resources and the capacities able to protect their populations and their infrastructure in these circumstances. Climate finance with justice is a must in today's world. Excellences, ce sommet porte sur un partenariat nouveau, réinventé par une génération nouvelle. Un partenariat d'égal à égal, fondé sur la complémentarité et l'intérêt mutuel. Cela veut dire investir ensemble dans les industries créées et détenues par les Africains. Renforcer les universités et les institutions de recherche africaines. Développer les capacités africaines d'intelligence artificielle afin que l'IA soit façonnée par des données africaines, des langues africaines, des chercheurs africains et un leadership africain. Bâtir des partenariats qui s'appuient sur les propres feuilles de route de l'Afrique, la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, l'agenda 2063 et les priorités nationales de développement. Et cela veut dire financer l'ambition africaine à des conditions justes et viables pour tous, avec un coût de capital qui soit accessible. La plus grande transformation de ce siècle n'est pas un marché, mais une génération. D'ici à 2050, une personne sur 4 sur la planète sera africaine. Les jeunes leaders réunis à ce sommet montrent déjà le visage de ce partenariat nouveau. Partout sur ce continent, des millions d'autres sont déjà à l'œuvre. Ils codent, cultivent, construisent, s'organisent et imaginent l'avenir. Et ils réclament une gouvernance démocratique et inclusive et des institutions responsables. Chers amis, la réussite du continent n'est pas seulement un enjeu africain. Quand l'Afrique réussit, le monde entier y gagne. L'ambition de l'Afrique exige des investissements à grande échelle, des systèmes internationaux plus justes et des partenariats ancrés dans le respect mutuel. Ensemble, avançons avec l'Afrique avec confiance, solidarité et l'espoir d'un avenir commun, et je vous remercie.
Another big round of applause for His Excellency. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to welcome our next speaker, who is a distinguished African diplomat, currently leading Africa's premier continental institution. He's a steadfast champion of continental integration and multilateral cooperation. Please welcome to the stage His Excellency Mahmoud Ali Yusuf, Chairperson of the African Union Commission.
Excellences, Monsieur William Ruto, Président de la République du Kenya,
Excellence, Monsieur Emmanuel Macron, Président de la République française, co-initiateur du sommet Africa Forward. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement. Excellences, Monsieur le Secrétaire général des Nations Unies, Mesdames et Messieurs. D'emblée, j'aimerais adresser nos remerciements au Kenya pour l'accueil de cet important événement. À travers cette rencontre, le Kenya et la France souhaitent impulser à l'Afrique une dynamique de progrès. En effet, l'Afrique doit se positionner pour peser sur les décisions globales. La géopolitique internationale est perturbée. L'économie mondiale vacille. Le multilatéralisme et la sécurité collective sont remises en question. Dans ce contexte incertain, notre continent se doit d'être aux avant-postes de l'alternance. Il est indéniable que l'Afrique possède des atouts majeurs. Démographie et jeunesse, terres et ressources minières, énergie renouvelable et hydrocarbures. En effet, transformer le continent résidera certainement dans la transformation de ces atouts en avantages comparatifs. Diversifier nos économies, industrialiser et innover, voici les recettes du succès. Une productivité accrue et la maîtrise des chaînes de valeur. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, il est possible aujourd'hui d'acquérir les technologies à moindre coût, de former les jeunes et nos femmes. Certes, l'énergie restera le principal cheval de bataille. Son abondance et sa disponibilité à prix coûtant est nécessaire. La compétitivité de nos économies passera aussi par l'accès au capital bon marché et à la soutenabilité de la dette. Elle est estimée aujourd'hui à 690 milliards de dollars, avec près de 90 milliards de flux financiers illicites et 75 milliards de surcoûts annuels. Il est temps que nos propres institutions financières continentales montent en puissance. C'est sur eux que nous devons nous appuyer pour le financement de nos infrastructures. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, vous connaissez parfaitement ces défis. Les solutions viendront de la cohérence de nos politiques, de l'engagement sans réserve de nos États membres et de la stabilité à travers le continent. Les institutions multilatérales sont appelées à être proactives, les partenariats plus équilibrés et le co-développement, un principe fondamental de la gouvernance mondiale. L'Afrique se tient prête à assumer davantage cette responsabilité sur la scène internationale et en particulier au sein du Sud global. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, la paix et la stabilité sont un défi important sur le continent. L'insécurité ne doit plus être un frein au flux d'investissements sur notre continent. Il est donc impératif de faire taire les armes sans délai ni hésitation. La Commission de l'Union africaine en a fait une priorité absolue. Your Excellencies, my speech has become irrelevant when I listened to our presidents here, in particular President Ruto. He touched upon all the issues I wanted to raise, but let me conclude my very brief remark by saying this. The future is for the African continent. The African continent will be the powerhouse of global growth. So let us work together, let us put our energies together and move forward. And I thank you.
Another big round of applause for His Excellency. Thank you so much. Your Excellencies, please allow me to briefly highlight the high-level roundtable discussions that will continue throughout the day. Immediately following the opening session, we'll proceed to the high-level plenary on energy transition and green industrialization in the adjacent room, Savo B. It's just right next. This will be followed by a high-level working lunch session on the reform of the international financial architecture, Savo C. Following the lunch working session will be a plenary on peace and security. Thereafter, we will then transition into parallel roundtable discussions on artificial intelligence and digital technologies, blue economy, health, and agriculture. In parallel, there will also be a special session on Congo Basin Climate Commission ahead of the closing ceremony. To ensure the smooth flow of the summit proceedings, members of the organizing team will be available throughout the venue to provide guidance. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause to our open plenary speakers. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. God bless Kenya. God bless Africa. God bless France. Asanteni sana. Allow me to hand over to Mr. Mike Gitonga.
Thank you, Vivian. Let's give a clap for Vivian for great moderation. Your Excellencies, that brings us to the end of this session, and would like to now invite all the presidents and heads of state to a family photo, which we're going to take right here on stage. So I'll kindly request that all the Excellencies for a family photo before we exit. All presidents and heads of state to kindly just be here on stage for a family photo. Right here. Give the heads of state room to leave, and for good order, I request that we leave in, I'll announce how we shall leave, just for good order and for the protocol officers to be able to take care of how we transition from here to Sabo room B. Your Excellencies, with your permission, we'll now be going to Sabo room B, but allow me to only heads of state and presidents kindly to proceed to Sabo room B for the next session.